Go ahead.
Hello and welcome to the third online certificate course on Indian foreign policy under Foreign Policy School, a FPRC initiative. I am Yashika Sharma, a student of BA Honours Political Science, third year from Maitri College for Women, University of Delhi. Currently, I am an intern at FPRC Online Foreign Policy School. We are honored to have with us today Dr. Aditi Malhotra, Editor-in-Chief of Canadian Army Journal. She is also a co-editor for the Journal of Intelligence, Propaganda and Security Studies. She is a PhD in Political Science from University of Munster, 2015 to 2020. Her doctoral dissertation topic was Middle Powers in the Indo-Pacific, Evolution of India's Security Role towards Southeast Asia and East Asia. She has a passion for research, writing, and editing. She has over 5 years of work experience as a research analyst and editor. Her experience in qualitative research dates to a decade. She has a demonstrated history of working in think tanks, research groups, and international organizations, where she worked on research projects independently and in a team. She also has been actively involved in conceptualizing and implementing new programs. Currently, she is working on 2 book manuscripts with international publishers and a range of book chapters and articles. Her latest book is India in the Indo-Pacific, which questions the dominant narrative on India's conduct in the Indo-Pacific. The book offers an alternate way to understand India and make sense of why it does what it does. We are honored to have you with us today, ma'am. We look forward to learning from your experience. Now, I would like to hand over to Professor Mahendra Gaur, Director, FPRC, New Delhi, to continue with the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Yashika, for welcoming the guests. And now I will ask Dr. Aditi to go ahead with her presentation. And before that, I would like to thank her for sparing time for the students. I hope the students will be able to understand what is said by her and add to their knowledge. So now it's all over to you, Dr. Aditi.
Thank you so much, Professor Gaur, and thank you so much, Yashika, for that detailed introduction. It was really kind of you. Thank you. Before I kind of begin, right, the whole topic of Indo-Pacific is very new. I think it's only been there for the last 10 years, technically, but more effectively in the last 5-6 years that we see it. Now, the question is, where does India come in between this whole thing? So Indo-Pacific as a concept is kind of talking about the integration of 2 theaters. One is the Indian Ocean region and the other is the Pacific. So for many years, we saw these 2 theaters as distinct from each other. We did not think that they were connected except for the transport and seaborne maritime trade. We never thought that they're really connected in that sense. But with the rise of China, suddenly now countries have started looking at the region very differently. And suddenly we have realized how the Indian Ocean region has become very important. And from a lot of countries' point of view, whether it is Japan or from the US and now even India and Australia, everyone now kind of understands how these 2 theaters, which were previously considered a bit distinct, are very interconnected. And why did this happen? Of course, it is the rise of China. It is the fact that the global economic power was shifting towards Asia, because for so many decades, it was concentrated in, the transatlantic and the Euro-Atlantic dimension. And now we see that shifting towards Asia. And because of this, there's a lot of change. Now, again, the bigger question, where does India feature in this? So if you look at Indo-Pacific, yes, there's a lot of talk about India. But if you look at India's history in the Asia-Pacific, sadly, we do not talk about India at that point in time. However, if we actually look at the history, India was equally relevant as one of the powers, right after it actually became independent. So from 1947 onwards, we see how India was actually engaging the broader Asian continent and the Asia Pacific region. And this was done by the first Prime Minister Nehru, who wanted to, have India take a very important and an international role. However, he also did not want to commit to, having military investments. Like the Prime Minister did not want to use the resources that India had to cater to security problems for, countries which are outside of the subcontinent. And this is why we saw that India was happy to play the role of a peacemaker. And this, of course, aligned with India's non-alignment policy, where we see that India wants to, be a part of a lot of international, developments and international affairs. But at the same time, it does not want to take a military action. It does not want to get involved militarily. Also because during the Cold War time, right, India did not want to add to the problems which already existed, and India did not want to get trapped into the whole great power competition between the US and USSR. So we actually see from the mid 1940s, like right after independence until the mid 1960s, we see India as a non-aligned actor in the Asia Pacific region, and we also see it as a regional peacemaker. So if we look at the Korean crisis which happened, or if we look at the first Indo-China war, interestingly, India was very much involved as a peacemaker. What it was trying to do was bring in different parties and talk to each other and try to find a solution to all the problems and crises which were ongoing. Now, of course, it always remains a question how effective India was, but that's, of course, just another thesis in itself. But we do see India, getting more and more involved as a peacemaker. And then we see the 1962 India-China war, and something changed in India. India realized that, okay, it was happy as a peacemaker, it was doing a lot of things internationally, but this did not help India in securing its own, military and security interests, because we, of course, saw that, the Indian military had a very huge defeat at the hands of the Chinese. And there was this awakening within India that, okay, something needs to change. And this is when India shifted its focus from a broader Asia Pacific region to just the subcontinent, because the leadership realized that we do not have the resources to kind of expand to the Asia Pacific region in that sense. So they realized, let us focus specifically on, say, the South Asian, continent, the subcontinent as such. And then we see how India is now no longer the Asia Pacific power, and it suddenly becomes a South Asian power. And the other difference, that we see is that suddenly, instead of being a peacemaker, India is actually happy to kind of be a security seeker. So it now wants to be a security actor, but again, just limited to the subcontinent. And this is how, we see things changing. And this continues, this phase continues till the 1990s. And in the 1990s, we suddenly see the disintegration of the USSR, and one of the most important military partners, economic partners, and diplomatic partners of India. So this was a very big jolt to the Indian leadership, because suddenly they were questioning, what do we do? Because, a lot of India's external policy, right, foreign policy, was really influenced by its relationship with the USSR, its relationship with the US. And now when its biggest partner was no longer in the existing form, there was a change again. And this time India realized if it wants to stay relevant in the changing world order, it needed to engage a lot more countries. And that is why we see a shift in India's foreign policy from 1991-92 onwards. Also because India was looking for more economic partners, it needed more diplomatic partners, which is why you'll also notice how after so many decades of not really engaging even Israel, India is even happy to engage Israel. It is happy to engage the Southeast Asian countries, which started with the Look East policy, right? So in 1992, we see India suddenly, being this cooperative power, an actor which wants to reach out to everyone and build diplomatic relations. And a lot of this, of course, is to do with the fall of the USSR. And that's when we see India projecting itself as an economic power and as a benign power. So from being a hardcore security seeker, involved in wars in the subcontinent, we now see India in the early 1990s trying to be an economic actor. And then again, this continues and around late 1990s, early 2000s, we see a shift again. And now this shift is again from a very economic outlook to a very security-driven outlook. Again, what are the reasons for this? So if you look at it, we had the nuclear tests in 1998, then we had the Kargil conflict in 1999. And now when we had these things, within the Indian establishment, they realized that even though, Kargil was relatively successful, there was a lot of there were a lot of lessons to learn from the conflict. And we had the Kargil Review Committee, and they realized that, okay, there needs to be a lot more focus on security. Otherwise, India will have to deal with a lot of such problems, because we had intelligence failure during the Kargil conflict. So the Kargil Review Committee actually looks at a lot of these aspects. Now, what is interesting is while this transition was taking place, the Indian leadership realized that it needed to focus more on security. And that is how, we see that transition happening towards security. But the problem was, at the same time, because of India's nuclear tests, a lot of countries were not willing to engage India. So India was kind of being, a lot of Western countries specifically were trying to project India as an outlier. And suddenly, you see that India and even the US, because you cannot deny that even though there were so many attempts to kind of, put pressure on India, India was now a nuclear power. And as a result, suddenly there was a lot more international, attention on India. Even the US, which at one point in time wasn't very willing to engage India, on equal terms, suddenly realized that it cannot ignore India and it needed to engage. And that is why, in the 2000s, we start seeing this dialogue between, the US and India. From India's side, it was, the Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh, and from the US side, it was, I think, Secretary, I don't remember the exact title, Strauss Talbot. So we have these dialogues happening, and over 2 years, India is able to build a stronger relationship with the US. And a lot of US allies, which had initially shunned India after the nuclear tests, also are more, are warming up to India around 2000s, early 2000s. And it's very interesting, while this was happening, even the Indian economy was growing. So as the Indian economy was growing, a lot of these countries started looking at India as a potential, swing state, as kind of from their point of view, a balancer to China in Asia, because at the same time, even China was rising, and China was kind of considered a security threat to the US and its allies. And India was now suddenly seen as a country which could be a potential partner to these countries. So we see, this change happening around early 2000s, and 2004, which is a very important landmark issue, development happened. Sadly, we had the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, and it was devastating, right? There were so many deaths, and it was not just India which was dealing with it, but a lot of neighboring countries as well. And now when this happened, we see the Indian government respond, in terms of humanitarian aid and relief operations, and a lot of missions were taken. And the Indian Navy and, the Indian machinery, actually for the first time in many years, was able to project the potential it has to kind of, help other countries in the region. And while this was happening, the US, Australia, and Japan, they took note, and they actually established a group with India, wherein all of them combined their resources to offer help to the Indian Ocean littorals. And this is when, again, the US and its allies realized that, okay, India has a lot more potential than how we anticipated before. And that is when the US began looking at India as a very important actor in terms of security domain, as a very important security actor to engage. And that is the reason we see from 2004 onwards, there's a lot more interaction between the US and its allies. Again, going down a few more years, we have the Quad, again, because they realized that as democracies of, the broader region, at a time when China was also rising, they realized that these democracies, which is India, US, Japan, and Australia, could actually come together and build, an arrangement which shows that, okay, that other smaller countries are not alone, because a lot of countries were facing, China's assertiveness. So this Quad came in, but of course, initially the Quad had a much more stronger security angle. And then they realized that this was not only increasing, China's anxiety and leading to greater assertiveness, but at the same time, they also realized that it was difficult to get all of the partners to combine all their, military and security efforts together on a lot of issues. Because even though all these countries, sorry, okay, sorry, I thought I heard someone. So even though we see, a lot of countries involved together, the Quad partners, it's not that all the countries always agree with each other on everything. There are, of course, frictions, and there are areas of disagreements. And as a result, Australia was the first one under the pressure, domestic pressure, and a lot of pressure from China. Australia was the first one to actually succumb to pressure, and they actually talked about leaving the Quad. Interestingly, India is always blamed for being that one, about being reluctant to be a part of Quad during the 2007-2009 period, but it was actually Australia which kind of withdrew. And India was quite all right with it, because India was also very unsure of where, the whole arrangement was going. So India kind of played along, and they were like, okay, fine, we have no issues. But the fact was that even India internally was confused where was this going, because India's problems with China remained, of course, right? But the problem was that China hadn't become like a big threat at that point in time. China was still seen as someone, okay, that we can manage, let's try to negotiate, let's try to figure out, a problem, a solution to the border problem. But if you actually look at it, after 2007, China's assertiveness increases. And a lot of this has to do with, the whole 2008 crisis that we see, the financial crisis. With the financial crisis, China actually came out stronger, and other countries, whether it is the US and its allies, for the first time realized that they were not as strong economic powers as they were pre-2008. And this is when China realizes that, oh, finally, it is my time to shine. And, you see greater assertiveness, you see China actually wanting to, be on all the important tables and kind of take decisions. And this, of course, this created problems for a lot of countries, not only for the countries who shared border problems with China, but even for smaller countries who were dependent on China economically or in terms of tourism and these aspects. So we see that happening. And, till almost 2012 and stuff, things are going on. We're still not a part of the Quad, but within India, there is a change. India starts realizing that it needs to kind of, become a security provider in the region. Otherwise, China would kind of dominate. And we also see Chinese increasing incursions in the Indian Ocean region. And that, of course, started building the whole narrative that, okay, now China was actually a prominent security threat. And after 2012, again, with changes within China, their military activities increased. They became more assertive, not just towards India along the border, along the McMahon line, which is the de facto border between India and China, but also, with other countries, whether it is Vietnam or Philippines. A lot of Southeast Asian countries were actually struggling with, how to deal with China. So after 2012, you start realizing that India, again, wants to be an important player in the Indo-Pacific, and it starts, projecting itself as a provider of net security in the Indian Ocean region. And at the same time, India also starts looking at itself as a leading power, because India realizes that if it does not step up its actions at this point in time, it will lose, because it was already so late when it came to dealing with China, and it did not want to kind of give away all the space, the diplomatic space and, the security space which existed to China per se. And as a result, we again see this transition happening within India from 2015 onwards, wherein we see India talking about itself being a leading power and projects itself as a stakeholder in the stability and security of the Indo-Pacific. And again, when this is happening, it is getting a lot of support from the US and its allies. But again, to mention, it's not that India agreed with everything in that aspect. But, so there were agreements, there were disagreements. And even as, India was competing with China on a lot of aspects, there were some areas of cooperation as well, whether it is India's economic ties with China, which kept flourishing regardless of what was happening on the border. And at the same time, you see India also kind of aligning with China on some of the aspects, whether it is, the change of international structures, the UNSC and all the multilateral forums which exist. This is again where India and China had similar views. When it came to Iran, India and China again had similar views. So even though both of these countries are actually at loggerheads with a border dispute and at the same time competing with each other for influence in the region, we also see them kind of cooperating. So there is, this cooperation and competition with China, and at the same time, greater cooperation with the US, but some disagreements as well. And this has continued, right? Like this feature has continued for a long time. And if you look at how things are today, you will notice how India today wants to be one of the leading powers, which wants to engage all the countries. Just like, during the non-alignment period, India did not want to engage or kind of align with one country and wanted to secure its interests by actually talking to everyone, by negotiating with everyone, because it realized that the moment it switches towards one side, it loses, gaining from the other countries, which is why we see that India engages the US in a lot of formats, whether it is the Quad or whether it is, other trilateral forums with US allies. But at the same time, India also engages Russia and China, which are technically, against the US and its allies. So India is one of those countries which is engaging almost all the actors and middle powers and major powers that exist, which is why, we see India engaging with the Russia, India, China format. We see India engaged in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So for a country which is technically with the ongoing border dispute with China, you would not expect a country to kind of engage China on a lot of different forums as well. However, this is where India is different, because India has now has been talking about multi-alignment, but nowadays it's talking about issue-based alignment, wherein it says, if I have an area of shared interest with one country, I will continue to engage and align on that specific issue. To give you an example, with the US, India is okay to partner strongly in the military and security domain to kind of, keep a check on Chinese activities. And at the same time, India is also okay to engage Russia and China in their different formats, wherein it wants to gain from that equation as well. Now, this has been a bit challenging, to say the least, for the Indian diplomats, because you're kind of balancing a lot of contradictory relationships. But so far it has, like, the Indian diplomats have managed to, kind of play both sides of the fence and play it effectively. But of course, like we've seen in the case of Ukraine, it is not always easy, because India does come under a lot of, criticism and pressure. But again, if you look at how India has always been, India has never aligned with any one country. It has always partnered with different countries to serve its own interests at a given point of time. Like during the Cold War, India was okay to partner with the USSR and, at the same time, take aid from the US. And today we see India aligning with almost all these countries for its own interests. Now, it's interesting that even though India is so, crucial in the Indo-Pacific region, India is not always as effective. There are a lot of domestic constraints as well, because of which sometimes even if India wants to do some things, it's unable to in the Indo-Pacific. Let me give you a few examples. If you look at the economic situation, after 2008 for India, the economic situation has been, kind of fluctuating. As a result, every time your economic situation is suffering, you do not have enough resources, right, to put into your defense budgets. So which is why you will notice that sometimes the defense budget goes up, but it also goes down. And in terms of actual money of the budget, which goes for acquisitions and weaponry, India has very limited money in that case. Also, there are a lot of systemic problems and stuff which exist. But because of this, a lot of the money that actually goes into the defense budget goes into other priorities of India. So India, no matter how much we talk about India being a maritime actor, it still has itself focused on the land border problems with Pakistan and China. So when it comes to comparing the maritime priorities versus the land-based priorities, of course, for India, the land-based priority is a bigger thing because that's a bigger threat. It's right in front of your eyes. So it's in that sense that you see a lot of money being going towards the land priorities. And because of it, sometimes the maritime priorities suffer. And we also have, this kind of a civil military divide wherein you notice that, things can be much more smoother in terms of functioning, but it becomes a problem because a lot of people, who come from the civil side may not have that strong military understanding. And from the military side, every time they expect something from, the civilian side, the military may not understand the civilian point of view, because sometimes the militaries expect that, okay, we need this, we need this, we need this. But they do not cater for, okay, how much money can the government provide? And at the same time, they cannot understand what would be the political implications for some of those military actions, right? So in that sense, there's always this civil military divide which exists, which sometimes makes it difficult for India to effectively implement some of its policies. And as a result of these things, you see how India being an effective actor, but at the same time, not being able to, completely commit to the region in that sense, which is why, you will always see a lot of people criticizing India, saying, oh, it's the weakest link in the Quad. But I can say it's just how India is, because there are domestic compulsions, there are problems for India in terms of structures as well. So as a result of all these things together, sometimes it's not been able to be more effective as an Indo-Pacific player. I have a lot more points, but I guess we could discuss that over, the question and answer round, if that suits you. Or if you want, I can, continue. You can give me the specific questions and I can deal with all the points that I have here.
Thank you, Dr. Aditi. I think you have very well, very exhaustively explained the domestic constraint on Indian foreign policy, and which is something which is not understood in India. Mm. And I think we cannot ignore this aspect of India's compulsion. We think that India should play a leading role, but there are certain, compulsions, constraints, and some, weaknesses also in the defense and civilian relationship structure and all that. All sorts of controversies come in all that. So we have to focus on that also. It's very good to be ambitious to become a leading power. I mean, nobody prevents you from thinking on those lines. The problem is, do we have the capacity? Do we have the resources? And that is something which is we should always keep in mind. So I know you have given rise to so many things, so many issues, and I think the students will come and raise their queries and try to understand this India's role in Indo-Pacific, how vital it is, why India could not do well in the past, and how India can move further in this. And I think I will talk to you about your book later. And before that, I will ask the participants to come with their question and introduce yourself and put your questions in a clear manner and be brief. Yes, come on.
And you can ask any questions, like don't think that it's a stupid question. Like I had that problem. I always thought that, oh, I need to come up with a very intelligent question, but just come up with questions. They're always helpful.
No, sometimes there are some very innocent questions. I tell you, students pose various shades of questions. I mean, sometimes it is just curiosity to know more from the guest speaker. And
curiosity is good. Curiosity is good.
So I always tell them this is not a classroom teaching, but it will add to your knowledge on the subject. So come on, be quick, and don't detain Dr. Aditi for a long. Just come on, be quick. Ask your question.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening. That's Pragnesh, right?
Introduce yourself.
I am Pragesh. I am from Delhi. I have just completed my master's in political science from Calcutta University. I just briefly wanted to know from you, India's neighborhood policy post 2015. It has led to, I mean, there used to be very amicable relations between India and the smaller neighboring countries post pre 2015, but post 2015 we have seen that we have seen some fraught relationships with Nepal, with Sri Lanka. So how does that play into the larger Indo-Pacific ambitions of India and its relationship with China? Because China has always, looked to use that string of pearls policy around India and to cover it up with all those nations which it essentially supports. So how does India's fraughted relationships with smaller neighboring countries play into the larger power play in Indo-Pacific?
That's a really interesting question. So you actually point out two things, and I'll actually deal with each one by one. Now, yes, of course, after 2015, we have seen that, India's relationship with its neighborhood in the immediate neighborhood is not as, good as it used to be. However, again, if you go to the history, we have seen very different phases where this has happened. Like if you look at the time of the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, this is pre-1990s, we actually noticed that was also the same time when India did not share very good relationships with, its immediate neighbors. Now, the biggest problem, when this happens, I'll not go into why that is so, but the problem that, how this plays out in the Indo-Pacific. The problem is every time your diplomatic energies, your resources, your economic resources, or the personnel that are a part of your government machinery, when they have to direct their efforts towards one specific region, of course, you have lesser time, energy, and resources to direct to other regions. So if we have more problems in the immediate neighborhood, for India, or for that matter, any country, the immediate neighborhood would always be a bigger priority as compared to its larger ambitions in a broader region. Because of this, every time India struggles with its problem in the neighborhood, it does not have the wherewithal and the time and diplomatic energy to, focus on its broader ambitions. So in one way, what it does is it constricts India within South Asia. And interestingly, this is also, something that Chinese are happy with and Pakistan is happy with, because for them, they're happy to see India restricted in the box of South Asia. And to a great extent, of course, they can be blamed for some aspects, but a lot of things also come in India's corner, right? That every time India is doing something, if the immediate neighborhood is suffering because of that and India has problems, it has to deal with them. And which is why we also see, if you look at the border problem with China right now, it is in the immediate neighborhood, right? So all the focus is on that. And because of this, you cannot always focus on the maritime aspect or in the Indo-Pacific commitments. And the second thing that you talk about, the string of pearls, right? Of course, this concept has been, it came from American authors and it's always been such. While, I would agree that, we do have China almost on all corners of India engaging different countries, and it kind of forms this string of pearls. But it's also important to know that a lot of what China does is not always because it's targeting India. Similarly, it's the same problem when you look at India-Pakistan dynamics. the fact that India wants to become an Indo-Pacific power and it has greater ambitions. Pakistan always thinks that India is doing this only to target Pakistan, right? Which is not the case, because for India, it has its own ambitions as well. So it's the same thing with China. I'm not saying that China is a friendly power or a good power, but I am saying that there are so many personal ambitions of China because China wants to be a great power. So a lot of things that it is doing is sometimes independent of India, but it is a part of their larger strategy to become a great power. And of course, because they are dealing with so many different regions and countries in India's neighborhood, it automatically kind of, becomes a pressure point for India, because they are building their capabilities in these regions, they are engaging these countries. But while they are doing this, at the same time, they also have that access to these regions. And the more access they have to these regions, the more pressure it puts on India, because capabilities can change, intentions can change overnight. So if today we think, oh, China is just doing this for its own ambitions and it has nothing against India, the problem with capabilities is that if you have any capability in any region, you can utilize it if your intentions change. If tomorrow China wants to attack India from, say, the other ports and not from the land, if it has its presence there established, it is so much more easier. So in that sense, yes, it becomes a pressure point for India. But of course, it's very important to notice that a lot of things that China is doing is also doing because its own, role in the world is changing and it wants to become a great power. And I'll end on a positive note that even though things have been really fraught with the immediate neighborhood for India, if you look at what's happening in Sri Lanka today, thankfully, India is actually helping Sri Lanka kind of, through different means and ways. And every time there are these areas of shared interests, India is actually trying its best to go ahead and build those equations and, kind of iron out the differences which have existed in the recent years. Let me know if you have a follow-up question for that.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Next question. Next question. Come on, be quick. Next question.
I think you're on mute.
No, I'm not mute.
No, not you. Anshika, I think she was asking a question. I think she's on mute. If you want, you can also type in the chat.
Anshika, you're not audible.
Not audible, sorry. But simply just, you can type your question in the chat. I'll be able to read that.
Meanwhile, is it okay if I ask my question?
For sure.
Oh, good evening, ma'am. I am Kanak. I'm a master's student and I'm studying diplomacy law in business at General School of International Affairs. And I'm specializing in international humanitarian law and peace and conflict studies. Could you please, shed a little more light on the multi-alignment and issue-based alignment? As in, I understand these two concepts to be very similar to each other. So how do we differentiate between the two?
Okay, kind of a very cool question. So this is something because I struggled with while I was doing my dissertation, because everything looks very similar, right? And then you see the terminologies keep changing. But before we talk about how these are different, I think it's very important to realize that all of these are just different instruments and different policies for India to, kind of either protect its own security interests or serve its own national interests, or actually establish itself as a much more crucial actor in the world today. So while we talk about multi-alignment and issue-based alignment, even non-alignment is kind of a part of the same string. And the underlying for all of these is that they serve India's purpose at any given point in time. So every time there is a change in the world order, India has to kind of pick up a new instrument or tool to kind of engage with the region. Now let me talk about multi-alignment. So multi-alignment actually came during Prime Minister Vajpayee's time. It wasn't termed as multi-alignment, but the practice, which was ongoing during that time was very much what is now known as multi-alignment. So what actually happened, as I just touched upon the fact that, India, after the nuclear test, it was almost shunned by all the countries, and it did not have a lot of support. And India realized that, even though after the 1990s, it was trying to engage a lot of different countries, but frankly, no one took India seriously, because at that point in time, the biggest and the most important feature of a country was its economic prowess and its economic power. And India wasn't performing as well as an economic actor during the 1990s, which of course changes in the 2000s. So when that changes, India realizes that, okay, now because we have that economic backing, a lot of countries are willing to engage us. Let's use this time to kind of, build equations which will serve our strategic purposes. Because in 2001, 2002, we start noticing this term called major power, India as a major power. In all Indian foreign policy speeches, we notice that India is like, oh, India is a major power now. So we need to actually, have a lot of equations, which is where India was willing to look at all major partners and align, multi-alignment in terms of not just bilateral alignments, but also kind of be on every important table, right? All those different formats which existed, India was willing to engage with all organizations, because it said that we need to do that to kind of serve our interest and kind of tap into the geopolitical opportunities that exist. So this is how it started during PM Vajpayee's time. And then it is actually taken on very strongly during the UPA-1 era. We noticed that, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh is able to build on that wave. And at the same time, because India is then doing exponentially well in terms of economics, so it is actually able to engage so many more countries. So it continues this, this practice of aligning with every power bilaterally and multilaterally. And of course, when this is changing, that time the problems with China weren't as big as they stand today. So it was relatively easy, because even the US was kind of trying to cooperate with China on some aspects, testing waters, seeing that, where is it that we can work with China. So that was happening. But what happened, after China became a stronger security threat, not just to India, but to to different countries at large, we start noticing that every country is now talking about alignments towards specific blocks. Of course, these are not like blocks in terms of how we saw during the Cold War, but we are seeing the contours and shapes of, the whole Quad on one side, the Indo-Pacific countries on one side, and the Chinese and, the Chinese partners on the other side. So we see these contours of these blocks. And of course, India is being forced by different, powers, mostly Western, to kind of not align as in being an ally, but by kind of being very, very strong in terms of security partnership, wherein India has to commit to, okay, you do this, and, how about going about such a relationship, which is where, because for the Indian leadership, now they have to distinguish and kind of have to reinvent this whole idea that while we are doing multi-alignment, we are also aligning with different countries. Because with Russia, India is aligning on a lot of shared interest, and the US as well. So of course, India was under the criticism as to, what are you up to? Because for a lot of countries, it's confusing, right? That what are you trying to do? So in part of that clarification, India came up with this concept of issue-based alignment, where it said that in the Cold War, our alignments were ideological, not India's, but generally every country's alignments were ideological. But India now says that now we do not believe in ideological alignment, but we are willing to align with different countries based on the shared interests that we have with them. So even as multilateralism is going on, we have this specific clarification that India is now into issue-based alignment.
Yes. Next question. Come on, be quick. There should be more.
Am I audible? Yes. Am I audible?
Yes. Yeah, you are.
Hi. Thank you for the session, ma'am. I have a question which has two parts actually. I hope it's all right. So my first part of the question is, why is India not a member of the APEC yet? And is the membership relevant, and is it significant to the economic interests of India with respect to the Indo-Pacific region and the Asia-Pacific region? And this is the first part of the question, ma'am. And the second part is, how has the Quad changed the way we look at the Indian Ocean region? And is the Malabar naval exercise an extension of the maritime priority that India is trying to assert with respect to the Indo-Pacific region?
Perfect. Can you just reiterate your question on the Quad, please?
how has Quad changed the way we look at the Indian Ocean region with respect to military and the economic side of it?
Mhm. Perfect. So let me start by India and the Apec and the RCEP and all those things. So for a lot of countries, and this is one of the biggest criticisms we saw with Donald Trump, that when US was engaging, they were only willing to engage in the military aspect with the Asia Pacific, the Southeast Asian countries and the East Asian countries, and they were not willing to put in the economic aspect, right? And I think that is also like something which is a very valid criticism of India, to be very frank, from the outside point of view, as to if India wants to kind of remain a relevant power, it can only do so much security wise. It needs to engage the region much more fruitfully in terms of supply chains and in terms of economics and trade. So from the outside point of view, that makes total sense. Like, I am all for it. But if you look at from the India's point of view, the problem is also, if you look at the RCEP, okay, which is a very China-dominated thing, and then you have the other different formats. The problem is, this is where there's a dichotomy between India's domestic interests and India's outside ambitions. So even if India wants to do a lot of things in terms of engaging with these countries and having free trade agreements, the problem is that for India, because every time you have free trade agreements, you have to kind of cut down on the barriers and allow more external actors to, have a fair play field in your country on those economic issues, which is where India is not very strong. Right? Domestically, India is still struggling with a lot of its sectors, because of which, except for IT sector, almost every sector is kind of vulnerable to outside influence. So if you have outside actors coming in agriculture or in medical and these aspects, it kind of plays against India's domestic constituencies. And for any leadership, the political leadership will first look at where do our votes come from. And if they notice that, especially after the 2008 crisis, India's economic health internally has not been the best. And of course, we have more external pressures due to the Ukraine war happening and due to a lot of supply chain problems due to COVID. India is already struggling with that. So there is this persistent fear in India that if it opens up its markets, it will have problems for the domestic, economic side. But again, the problem is, to a lot of degree, our engagement with these countries in terms of supply chains, or even in terms of building roads and stuff, also struggles because of problems within the bureaucracy. So there are so many different agencies within India that sometimes coordinating and having a smoother approach on everything does not work. Because for something, it's the economic ministry dealing with that, like the finance ministry dealing with it. Sometimes it's, the defense ministry involved. So it's so many different actors within that, even if India, or for that matter, any country, wants like a perfect, smooth policy implementation, it will always struggle because bureaucracies are always complex to work with. So this was my first one. And how has India changed? So the Quad changed. Now, what is very interesting about this question is that even though India is very happy to engage with, the Quad and other actors, India is also very jealous about the Indian Ocean region. For India, the Indian Ocean is one of its priorities. Within the Indian Ocean, of course, if you look at the Northern Indian Ocean, that comes under India's primary area of interests. And if you look at the region which is further ahead in the Indian Ocean, again, it's a secondary area of interest. The Pacific and the other side, the Gulf, they are like the third areas. They're not as important as these. So even though India is very happy to kind of have a lot of foreign actors engage with India in the region, and this has been so for almost decades since India's independence, it does not want to give away the space in a manner where India is not the main actor. So if you even look at, the AUKUS, India was initially very reluctant of where this is going, because it is kind of, without India. And then you see this engagement happening, between these very crucial countries, and Australia kind of being close to the Indian Ocean region kind of, adds to that sense of insecurity for India. But of course, nowadays, rather than shunning all foreign powers, India realizes it's more important to engage them on terms which are more favorable to India. So I guess the Quad is one of those aspects where it's willing to engage. So India remains a crucial power and one of the decision makers in the broader arrangement. And your next question, the Malabar, of course, so there's a lot of posturing in international relations, which of course I'm sure you know. And a lot of what happens in terms of, the military drills and all these things, they are symbolic. Also, apart from the fact that they're trying to build interoperability between different actors, they're trying to say how, navies and how different parts of the countries can actually merge together in case there's ever a problem. How do they come together to, fight a common adversity? While they do this, there is also so much symbolism. So for the Malabar exercise, the fact that now we also have Japan, as a permanent member of the series, this actually shows that, and of course, India was very reluctant initially. India wanted it just, to be a very restricted exercise. But you notice every time India and China have problem, India takes out one new tool, kind of putting pressure on China, saying, okay, we will not go there, but we will do this. So the fact that it actually took in Japan and was okay, with greater membership, kind of showcased India as an actor, which was telling China that, okay, we have options and we will use them. And of course, it also kind of, projects India as a bigger maritime actor in the region, because you're kind of calling a lot of these powers, they're happy to engage you. So it also kind of builds and bolsters India's image as a maritime actor in the Indian Ocean. Let me know if I've answered all your questions.
Yeah.
You have. I just have a small follow-up question on the first part. So given how the war has elucidated how there's a lot of supply chain disruption given the war and the pandemic, where do you think we can strike a balance between import substitution and make in India indigenous production versus opening up the borders for more free trade agreements and for tariff reductions and all of that? Where's the balance tilted?
Okay, like, to be very frank, I need to be a leader to kind of give you the best answer for this. So I think this is an ongoing challenge for India, but I think a lot of the blame is also to be taken by India. The problem is that domestically, we haven't strengthened, our economy and our different actors to a level where they can compete with international actors. And which is why, we are struggling in terms of import and export. Now, the problem is there are different points of view on this. For me personally, I am a proponent of more open borders, wherein, there is more competition and stuff. But there's also the other side, which believes that, if you have those, your own people will suffer at the end of the day. So I think for India, the strengths, wherever the strengths lie, those areas need to be really utilized. Like the IT sector, India is doing very well. And I think that is the only sector where India does not have a problem. It says, okay, let as many international players come in and we are cool with it. But in terms of production, in terms of say something as basic as, cloth production or agriculture or dairy products, this is not an area, because we have monopolies here. The fact that Amul even today is such a big actor and it does not have that kind of competition, it has a very protected environment to function in, right? But then the problem is if you have new actors and if these products get replaced, they affect the common man. So there's always this question about, who do you, kind of give a priority? Sometimes your international ambitions, your economic policies, or to your voter. So, as an analyst, it's very easy to kind of give recommendations, but for a person who has to go and get votes the next time, I think it's a much difficult thing.
Yes, next question.
Am I audible now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Thank you for the insights in the session. I had a question regarding major powers are having revisionist behavior, which is also detrimental and also related to the point that you stated about capabilities and incentives and how they're changing and how it could impact the international order. With regards to Indo-Pacific region, United States, China, all these powers have shown revisionist behavior. Do you feel that this challenge could become of a concern for India in the coming years, or do you feel that we can easily manage with the initiatives that you suggested in earlier questions as well? So how do we look at this? Thank you.
Thank you, Anshika. So, okay, now the interesting part about this question is the whole revisionist attitude, right? What is interesting is a lot of great powers and major powers, some of them have that. The only problem is for a lot of actors, they do not always have the capabilities and the resources to project those. So even if you look at India's history, India wants to be a very crucial actor, right? And I always wonder, like, if India actually ends up getting all the resources which a great power has, how would India react and how would India be, right? Because if any country wants to be a big player, it will always have, I'm not saying revisionist in that sense, but it will always have great ambitions. Now, if you look at, say, Russia, or if you look at China, if you look at US, all of these countries have this concept known as, US exceptionalism or Chinese exceptionalism or the Russian exceptionalism. Even India has it. Like, we believe that, oh, we can be a great power and we would be the best great power. Chinese believe that, no, we would be a great power, we would be a just great power. And, we would not be like the imperials of the European times. And the US also feels that we are like, fair. The problem with revisionism is that, when combined with your ambitions to kind of take a broader role in the region, it always goes wrong. Now, the problem that India and the world is facing today is that we have two actors. One of them is China. Russia, yes, we can talk about their revisionism, but the problem is how successful they are after this war is a bigger question, because I personally feel they'll be worse off in every aspect after this war, and they may not be as big a trouble as we anticipated to be. But in terms of China, of course, China also has that idea of Chinese exceptionalism. They believe, like, if you look at Chinese history, they believed in the idea of the Middle Kingdom, that they believe that they are the center of the world and everything is around them. So, such ideational aspects always exist. And what has happened with China is now they have the resources to kind of, play on those ambitions and to play on those ideas, which is why we see its revisionism in so many forms, whether it's, the 9 dash lines kind of claiming the whole of South China Sea, or claiming even, not just Tibet, but also Arunachal Pradesh as Tibet. So that always exists. And this is a major challenge for India. The problem is that no country individually can deal with China at this point in time. Even the US, which was once a provider of global security, does not have the capability now. What the US has turned into now is more of a burden sharer. It wants every country to come with it and share that, global security burden. So no country can do it on its own. As a result, now we are seeing all the countries clubbing up, but I think everyone will only club together and try to, stay away from not containing, but managing China until things go horribly wrong. Because I feel the day things go horribly wrong for the world, that is when all the Quad and stuff, which may not have strong security backing right now, would actually securitize. But again, this we are waiting for a time when things go horribly wrong. Until then, all the countries will try to manage, not get into a war, try their best to stay away, because from economic point of view, a war is not going to be beneficial for any country, because all the countries are struggling with, economic woes and economic problems. But yes, the revisionism remains a challenge. And I do not think that the current efforts are enough. I do not think so.
Yeah, next question.
Hello, ma'am. Am I audible?
Oh, yes, you are, Uma.
Yeah. So I am Uma, and I recently graduated from Delhi University, where I pursued my majors, economics and political science. So my question is not exactly about the situation, but instead it's more about the kind of opportunities that one can have if they pursue South Asian studies. So does it really have a great scope?
Okay, so you're saying, like, in terms of, as a researcher, like, does it have a lot of scope?
For masters and PhD. So do you think it has a lot of scope, not just in in the research point of view, but also when it comes to other job opportunities?
Mm-hmm. So Uma, again, I think that's interesting because I went through that struggle, I guess, 10, 15 years back after I had completed my master's and I was looking for, jobs. The thing with South Asia is, now with the whole Indo-Pacific concept, there is greater demand for researchers and a lot of greater demand for young researchers. The problem in the think tanks is that we have a very big gap between, the senior leadership and the junior leadership. The middle researchers, right, are literally not existing in terms of a lot of good quality. And this is a criticism that I have heard from a lot of my American counterparts, who say we want to reach out to researchers in India, but either they are super senior who we've heard for the last 20 years, or we have super juniors who are still building their skill set. Because of this gap, I think there's so much scope for everyone in South Asia. But I would always recommend that, don't just look at South Asia as, an exclusive block. I would always recommend that have a much more broader, area of study wherein you can pick and choose regions based on, what is actually in demand that time. So like Indo-Pacific right now is like the big thing. So anything, coming from South Asia is going to be really helpful. And yes, there's a lot of scope, but again, there are think tanks, there are government jobs, which may not be as many as the opportunities in think tanks. But I guess this is a great time to be in this field, because when I was, when I started working in India, we had very limited think tanks and they had just started. Now you have so many international and national players in the think tank business that if you want to actually get into that, there is so much scope. And of course, universities, their programs are building, you have greater funding from outside as well, because everyone wants to engage India. So this is a really good time. And good luck with this.
All right, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
So now the last question, if any. Otherwise, I have to discuss something with Dr. Aditi.
For sure. The only problem is that your voice is a bit, it's not very clear, but I'll try to understand.
Yeah. No, just Dr. Aditi, I want to just a simple query. I want to know your views. That what is happening in Taiwan now? U.S. attention on Taiwan now. Do you think it is just to discourage China from repeating Ukraine in this area?
Okay, that's like an interesting one. I guess the problem with what is happening in Taiwan, we can't really put it into just one side and say that it is because they want to discourage China from taking Taiwan, or if it wants to do something. To begin with, it's very important to realize that this visit is not a US president supported visit. And again, what is happening on the inside, we do not know. Perhaps within the US, there is strong agreement between Biden and Speaker Nancy Pelosi. But I think outside, the fact is that this is not projected as an official US visit. It's more of, okay, there is one important branch of the US government, which is not under the control of president, because it is a co-equal different branch of the US government. So it's very important to notice that this is not a Biden visit. Having said, at the same time, I think it's also, there are a lot of angles to it. There's an internal angle, the fact that, for Democrats to go into elections eventually, this is a very good point, because it kind of showcases the Democrats as, oh, wow, we are doing well. We are kind of questioning China, because the biggest criticism of the Republicans in the US is that President Biden is really weak on China. So for the speaker, she also has her political intentions as well. But at the same time, now, if we look at the broader thing, of course, the fact that this is coming in the backdrop of the US invasion of Ukraine, I think it kind of does give it that, flavor, and it is a very rightful flavor, because Speaker Pelosi actually is talking about solidarity with Taiwan. It is actually saying that, yes, in case something goes wrong, we are there to defend you. And it's very interesting to note that in this year itself, President Biden has said this 3 times, that, okay, in case China invades Taiwan, what would the US do? US very openly said, we have a commitment to the country and we will defend it. So there has been these increasing tensions. And I think what is important is that this is also kind of questioning to how strong Xi is, because if you look at the whole internal situation in China, Xi Jinping will actually have a third term this year. And on 1st August, PLA actually had its anniversary. So it is a very interesting times in terms of, signaling, because you're kind of actually telling China and a lot of smaller countries, not just Taiwan, but a lot of other smaller countries, that if things go wrong, you have American commitment. Because there have been so much criticism about the fact if the US will actually remain committed to the region. The problem is because of the whole European crisis going on, everyone thinks that the whole American focus is on Europe and the Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific countries will suffer again. So this is more like a reassertion of that commitment as well. But then there are international angles, there are domestic angles. And the fact is that for China, this is also an affront to the whole idea of Chinese sovereignty. So even the Chinese would kind of react. But I do not see a war happening. A lot of people are thinking there'll be a war. I do not see that. But I do see that the tensions are only going to rise. And China will now put in a lot of policies and economic pressure on Taiwan, which would be long-term, which is not going to be overnight. This would be long-term, and we will see its impact on Taiwan and also on the US to some extent. I don't know if I've answered your question well.
Yeah, very well. I mean, actually, this is the current scenario, and which is very important one. And definitely, I wanted you to enlighten the students about this. And
I actually have an interview on the same topic, which came out yesterday. It was taken by one of the Pakistani YouTubers. So if you want, feel free to, have a look at that.
We will try to find out. Lastly, Dr. Aditi, about your book. Do you have a copy of it before you?
I don't actually. It's in Germany. I'm still waiting for my, package to arrive in Canada. So it's a problem. But the fact that it's online, I don't know if you were able to.
Yeah. We are going to circulate it among the students, and I'm also going to put it on LinkedIn.
Perfect.
So,
like for all the participants, my book is actually open access. Everyone can get a digital copy, and professor will actually send it across to everyone. And feel free to get in touch with me if you have any views on the books, or if you want to review it, just feel free.
I will reshare it on my post, and so it will have wider audience and all that. And you will definitely come to know about the reactions of the comments of the people on your book and all that. So thank you very much, Dr. Aditi. It has been a wonderful time, and I'm very really grateful to you for sparing time and taking pace to.
It's always a pleasure.
No, it is really a pleasure to hear you. And whenever occasion arises next time, I will definitely like to travel you. Something is going to happen there, and you are writing on that. And we hope to continue to get your cooperation and guidance for our students.
Sure.
So
no, it's always a pleasure to talk to like emerging analysts and scholars, and it's actually so good to see so many women here, like so many. So it's actually really good and encouraging. And thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you
so much.
Okay, and I'm just with your permission, I am putting it to an end. Thank you.
For sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your questions.